Welcome back, everyone. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. My name is Jake, and I've been hauling freight across these United States for 23 years come December. I've seen road rage that would make your blood run cold, weather that could kill a man in minutes, and mechanical failures that defy explanation. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I witnessed on Highway 67 outside Marfa, Texas, on a moonless night in October 2019. I was running a load of electronics from El Paso to San Antonio, taking the scenic route through the Trans-Pecos because the interstate was backed up with construction. It was one of those nights where the darkness seems to press against your windshield like black velvet, so thick you could almost reach out and touch it. The only sound was the steady rumble of my Peterbilt's engine and the occasional crackle from the CB radio. Channel 19 was dead quiet, which should have been my first warning. I'd heard the stories about Marfa, of course. Every trucker who's run the Texas Triangle knows about the mystery lights. Local folks have been seeing strange glowing orbs in the desert since the 1880s. Scientists blame it on atmospheric refraction, swamp gas, or car headlights reflecting off temperature inversions. But truckers, we know better. We know there are things out there that science can't explain with fancy words and theories. It was 2:47 a.m. when I first saw them. I remember the exact time because I'd just glanced at my clock, calculating how many hours I had left on my logbook before I'd have to take my mandatory rest break. That's when something caught my peripheral vision, a soft amber glow hovering about 50 feet off the ground, maybe a quarter-mile south of the highway. At first, I figured it was a radio tower beacon or maybe some rancher's security light, but as I watched, the light began to move. Not the erratic bobbing of a helicopter or the steady arc of an airplane, but a smooth, purposeful gliding motion that seemed to defy gravity itself. It was beautiful in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. Breaker 19. This is Diesel Jake eastbound on 67, I called into my CB microphone. Anyone else seeing those lights south of the highway near mile marker 91? Nothing but static answered me back. Not even the usual late-night chatter from insomniacs or the lonely voices of other drivers pushing through the night. Just that empty, crackling silence that every trucker knows means you're truly alone out there. The single light had multiplied by now. 3, then 5, then what looked like a dozen glowing orbs dancing in the desert air like fireflies the size of basketballs. They pulsed with that same warm amber light, sometimes dimming to barely visible specks, then flaring bright enough to cast shadows on the asphalt ahead of my truck. I should have kept driving. Every instinct I'd developed in over 2 decades on the road screamed at me to maintain speed, keep my eyes forward, and get the hell out of whatever was happening in that desert. But curiosity killed the cat, as they say, and I found myself easing off the throttle, slowing from 70 to 60, then 55. That's when things got personal. One of the lights, the brightest one, maybe twice the size of the others, suddenly shot toward the highway like a comet. But instead of burning out or crashing to earth, it stopped directly above the roadway about 100 yards ahead of my truck. It hovered there, pulsing slowly, waiting. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles going white. 23 years of driving had taught me to trust my gut, and my gut was telling me to floor it and get past that thing as fast as possible. But my CB radio chose that moment to explode with static so loud and harsh it felt like needles in my ears. "Turn around!" a voice crackled through the interference. Not words exactly, but something that my brain interpreted as words. "Go back." I keyed my mic with a shaking hand. "Who is this?" "Identify yourself." The static cleared for a moment, replaced by perfect silence. Then, in a voice as clear as if someone was sitting in my passenger seat, You don't belong here after dark. The light ahead of me suddenly blazed brighter, filling my cab with amber illumination so intense I had to squint. My engine began to sputter, the steady rumble becoming an irregular cough that sent ice water through my veins. In over 2 decades of driving, I'd never had this truck let me down, not once. More lights appeared on both sides of the highway now, a whole constellation of them dancing in the desert air. They moved with purpose, not the random drifting I'd expected. Some darted back and forth like they were playing tag. Others formed geometric patterns, triangles, squares, perfect circles that rotated slowly against the star-filled sky. My CB crackled again. This time it wasn't words, but something that sounded almost like music. A low, humming melody that seemed to resonate in my chest cavity. The lights began to pulse in rhythm with the sound, creating a hypnotic light show that made it hard to keep my eyes on the road. That's when I felt it, the truck beginning to decelerate on its own. My foot was steady on the accelerator, but we were slowing down, as if some invisible force was dragging against my trailer. The speedometer needle dropped from 55 to 45, then 35. The engine wasn't coughing anymore, it was purring like a contented cat, but we were losing speed with every passing second. Panic started to set in. I'd heard stories from other drivers about trucks mysteriously losing power in certain areas, about electronics going haywire near military installations or during severe thunderstorms. But this was different. This felt intentional, like something was actively taking control of my rig. I tried downshifting, then upshifting, working through the gears like I was trying to get unstuck from mud. Nothing worked. The truck continued its steady deceleration until we were barely crawling at 15 miles per hour. The lights seemed to approve, growing brighter and moving closer to the highway. "What do you want?" I shouted at my CB microphone, not caring if I sounded crazy. Out here in the middle of nowhere with those impossible lights dancing around my truck, crazy seemed like the most rational response. The humming music stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, one by one, the lights began to move toward my truck, not attacking exactly, but approaching with the slow, deliberate movements of predators surrounding their prey. The first light reached my passenger side and began to pace alongside my cab, matching my crawling speed perfectly. Up close, I could see it wasn't just a simple glowing orb. There were patterns inside the light, swirling geometries that hurt to look at directly. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, like staring into the heart of an alien sun. More lights joined the first one. They surrounded my truck, front, back, both sides, creating a convoy of impossible illumination rolling down Highway 67 at 15 miles per hour. My CB radio had gone completely silent. Not even static now. The only sounds were my engine's contented purr and my own ragged breathing. I tried my cell phone, thinking maybe I could call 911, report some kind of emergency. But the screen showed no signal, not even the single bar I usually got in this remote area. I was completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in a bubble of amber light rolling through the Texas desert. The light closest to my driver's side window began to pulse faster, and I made the mistake of looking directly at it. For just a moment, I swear I saw something inside that glow. Not a face exactly, but a suggestion of intelligence, of awareness looking back at me. It knew I was there. It knew I was afraid, and somehow that seemed to amuse it. My truck began to accelerate on its own. Not the gradual increase I'd expect from easing back onto the throttle, but a smooth, steady acceleration that brought us back up to highway speed in seconds. The lights kept pace effortlessly, maintaining their formation around my rig like some kind of otherworldly escort. For the next 10 minutes, we traveled down Highway 67 together. Me gripping the steering wheel so tight my hands cramped, and them gliding alongside like they owned the road. I felt like I was in a parade, the grand marshal of some cosmic celebration I'd never asked to join. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. The lights flared once brilliantly, bright enough to turn night into day for a heartbeat. My CB exploded with static one final time, and then they were gone, vanishing into the desert air like they'd never existed at all. My truck's engine immediately returned to its normal rumble. The speedometer showed 70 miles per hour, exactly where I'd set my cruise control before this whole nightmare began. My CB radio crackled back to life with the normal late-night chatter of drivers on distant highways. "Breaker 19, eastbound Kenworth at mile marker 95, a voice called out. "Anyone else see those strange lights a few minutes ago?" I grabbed my microphone with hands that were still shaking. "This is Diesel Jake. I saw them too, driver. What's your 20? "About 5 miles behind you, looks like. Damnedest thing I ever witnessed. They were dancing around some truck up ahead. Looked like they were escorting him down the highway." I pulled over at the next wide spot and climbed out to inspect my truck, expecting to find some sign of what had happened. Scorch marks, unusual wear on the tires, anything that would prove I hadn't just hallucinated the whole encounter. What I found instead made my blood run cold. On both sides of my trailer, burned into the aluminum siding in perfect geometric patterns, were symbols I'd never seen before. They weren't random scorch marks or the kind of damage you'd get from an electrical fire. These were deliberate, precise markings that looked like they'd been etched with a laser. Each symbol was about 6 inches across, and they formed 2 parallel lines running the length of my trailer. I took pictures with my phone, thinking nobody would believe me without proof. But when I looked at the screen, the images showed nothing but blank aluminum siding. The symbols were clearly visible to my naked eye, burned deep enough into the metal that I could run my fingers along the grooves, but the camera couldn't capture them. I never reported the incident officially. Who would I call? What would I say? "Hello, officer. I'd like to report that my truck was escorted down the highway by mysterious lights that burned invisible symbols into my trailer. They'd have me committed or at least require a drug test that would end my career. Instead, I finished my run to San Antonio, dropped the load and headed home to Oklahoma. But those symbols remained on my trailer for months afterward, visible to me and apparently to other truckers who'd had their own encounters with things that shouldn't exist. More than once at truck stops along my regular routes, another driver would approach me and ask quietly, "You've seen them too, haven't you?" The symbols finally faded after about 6 months, gradually becoming fainter until they disappeared entirely. But I still run Highway 67 sometimes, usually during daylight hours. I've never seen the lights again, though other drivers report sightings on a regular basis. Sometimes late at night, when I'm rolling through some remote stretch of highway, my CB will crackle with that strange musical static. When that happens, I turn the radio off and keep my eyes firmly fixed on the road ahead. I've learned that some invitations are better left unanswered. The Marfa lights are still there, still dancing in the desert for anyone brave or foolish enough to look. Scientists still offer their rational explanations, and tourists still drive out from town hoping to catch a glimpse of the phenomenon. But us truckers who've experienced it firsthand know the truth. There are things moving in the darkness that don't follow the rules of our world. And sometimes, if you're unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, they'll decide to take you along for the ride. I'm Sarah Chen, and I've been driving the big rigs for 15 years. Started when I was 22, fresh out of trucking school and dumb enough to think I could conquer any highway in America. These days, I know better. Some roads will conquer you if you let your guard down for even a second. It was February 2018, and I was hauling a load of medical supplies from Denver to Kansas City on Interstate 70. Winter in the Midwest can be brutal, but this particular storm was something special. The Weather Service was calling it a historic blizzard event, which is meteorologists speak for stay the hell off the roads if you have any sense. Unfortunately, sense doesn't pay the bills, and medical supplies don't deliver themselves. My dispatcher had already delayed the load twice due to weather, and the receiving hospital was getting desperate. Sometimes you have to roll the dice, even when the odds are stacked against you. I'd made it through the Colorado passes without too much trouble thanks to good winter tires and 20 years of experience driving in snow. But by the time I hit the Kansas border, visibility had dropped to maybe 50 feet, and the wind was howling across the plains like something out of a horror movie. Ice crystals pelted my windshield so hard it sounded like machine gun fire. The smart thing would have been to find a truck stop and wait it out. But the nearest stop was still 40 miles ahead, and my fuel gauge was already showing less than a quarter tank. In weather like this, 40 miles might as well be 400. Trucks don't get good mileage when they're fighting headwinds and slush, and running out of diesel in a blizzard is a death sentence. So I kept pushing forward, maintaining a steady 40 miles per hour in the right lane, while other vehicles crawled past me or pulled off to wait for better conditions. My CB was alive with chatter, drivers sharing road conditions, warning about accidents, or just talking to stay alert in the hypnotic swirl of snow. That's how I knew something was wrong when Channel 19 went dead quiet around 11:30 p.m. In 15 years of driving, I'd never heard the CB completely silent during a storm like this. There should have been constant traffic. Drivers asking about conditions ahead, reporting their position, sharing information about open truck stops or available parking. Radio. Chatter is our lifeline out here, especially in bad weather. The silence felt ominous, like the moment before a tornado touches down. I keyed my microphone. Breaker 19, this is westbound Sarah at mile marker 310. Anyone out there got their ears on? Nothing, not even static, just the empty silence of an open channel with nobody listening. I tried again. Any eastbound traffic, what are conditions like ahead? This is a westbound Volvo looking for some local knowledge. Still nothing. It was like every truck on I-70 had suddenly vanished, leaving me alone on a highway that normally carried thousands of vehicles every hour. The isolation was complete and terrifying. That's when I heard the voice. Westbound Volvo, it said, cutting through the silence with perfect clarity. The voice was male, middle-aged, with the calm professionalism of a veteran driver. This is eastbound Charlie. You need to start looking for a place to get off this highway, driver. There's a situation developing at mile marker 247 that you don't want to roll into. Relief flooded through me. Finally, another driver willing to share information. I grabbed my microphone. Thanks for the heads up, eastbound Charlie. What kind of situation are we talking about? Accident? Road closure? The response came immediately. Multiple vehicle pileup, driver. Black ice under the overpass at 247. I count at least 4 cars and a pickup truck. Looks like emergency crews are still trying to get to the scene. You've got about 20 minutes to find an alternate route if you maintain current speed. I checked my GPS. Mile marker 247 was exactly where he said it would be, about 18 miles ahead at my current pace. But the GPS wasn't showing any traffic delays or incidents. Sometimes the systems lag behind reality, especially during severe weather, so that wasn't necessarily unusual. Copy that, eastbound Charlie. I appreciate the warning. Are you seeing any good exits between here and there where I can get off and take alternate routes? Negative, driver. Your best bet is the truck stop at exit 245. It's going to be crowded, but they've still got parking available in the back lot. Better to wait this storm out than risk running into that mess ahead. That made sense. Professional drivers look out for each other, especially in conditions like this. I started preparing to take the exit at 245 already mentally calculating how the delay would affect my delivery schedule. Thanks again, eastbound Charlie. This is westbound Sarah signing off. Drive safe out there. You too, driver. Remember, it's better to be late than never arrive at all. The wisdom in those words resonated with me. I'd rather explain a late delivery to my dispatcher than have him explain my death to my family. I began watching for the exit signs through the swirling snow. But as I drove, something nagged at me about the conversation. The voice had been unusually clear for CB transmission, especially in weather like this. Atmospheric conditions during storms usually created static and interference that made communication difficult. This guy had sounded like he was sitting right next to me. More troubling was the fact that no other drivers had joined the conversation. Normally, when someone reports a major accident, half a dozen other truckers chime in with additional information, alternate routes, or just acknowledgement that they heard the warning. The silence from everyone else was starting to feel wrong. I tried calling out on the CB again. Breaker 19, this is westbound Sarah at mile marker 235. Any other drivers out there monitoring channel 19? Silence. Complete empty silence. Eastbound Charlie, you still monitoring? Nothing. It was like he'd never existed at all. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the heater struggling against the storm. I'd been driving long enough to develop good instincts about people and situations, and those instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. I grabbed my cell phone and dialed the State Highway Patrol's non-emergency number. It took several tries to get through. The storm was affecting cell towers as well as everything else, but finally a dispatcher answered. Kansas Highway Patrol, this is Dispatcher Williams. Hi, this is Sarah Chen. I'm a commercial driver currently eastbound on Interstate 70 at mile marker 236. Another trucker just warned me about a multiple vehicle accident at mile marker 247, but I'm not seeing any traffic alerts on my systems. Can you confirm if there's an incident at that location? There was a pause while she checked her computers. Hold on, let me look. Mile marker 247 on Interstate 70 eastbound. Yes, ma'am, we do have units responding to a multi-vehicle accident at that location. 4 passenger vehicles and a pickup truck. When did you receive this information? My hands started shaking. About 10 minutes ago. How long ago did the accident occur? The first 911 call came in approximately 8 minutes ago. We're still trying to get emergency crews to the scene due to the weather conditions. How did you say you found out about this? Another trucker warned me over the CB radio. Said he was eastbound and had already passed the scene. Another pause, longer this time. Ma'am, we haven't had any eastbound commercial traffic report passing that accident scene. Our first responders are still en route, and the highway is completely blocked in both directions at that location. No one has gotten past that accident yet. The phone nearly slipped from my numb fingers. Are you sure? Positive. We've got units stationed at mile markers 250 and 244 to direct traffic off the highway. No commercial vehicles have passed through eastbound since the accident occurred. I thanked the dispatcher and hung up, my mind reeling. The accident was real, exactly where and exactly when the voice on the CB had said it would be. But there was no way anyone could have driven past it yet to report it. The highway was completely blocked. So who was eastbound Charlie? I took the exit at mile marker 245 just as the voice had suggested. The truck stop was indeed crowded, packed with drivers waiting out the storm. As I maneuvered my rig into one of the few remaining parking spots, I noticed several other truckers gathered around the fuel desk, talking in hushed tones. Inside the truck stop, the conversation stopped when I walked up to the group. These were all experienced drivers, the kind of men and women who'd seen everything the road could throw at them. But tonight, they all looked shaken. You hear about the pileup at 247? One of them asked me. I nodded. Got warned about it on the CB. Another driver said he'd passed the scene and was warning westbound traffic. The other truckers exchanged glances. What channel? Asked a woman with 20 years of road dust in her voice. Channel 19. Called himself Eastbound Charlie. More glances. The woman spoke again. We've all been monitoring 19 for the past hour. Nobody said a word about any accident. First we heard about it was when the highway patrol started setting up detours. That's impossible, I said. I had a full conversation with him. He told me exactly where the accident was, how many vehicles were involved, everything. An older driver with a gray beard stepped forward. Miss, I've been driving this route for 30 years. There ain't been nobody named Charlie using Channel 19 tonight. Hell, there ain't been nobody using Channel 19 at all for the past couple hours. Dead as a graveyard out there. They were all staring at me now, and I could see the mixture of concern and suspicion in their eyes. Was she hallucinating? Heat exhaustion? Drugs? The questions were unspoken but obvious. I know what I heard, I said firmly. Someone warned me about that accident, and if I'd ignored the warning, I'd be part of that pileup right now. The gray-bearded driver nodded slowly. Oh, I believe you heard something, miss. Question is, what exactly did you hear? Over the next few hours, as we waited for the highway to reopen, I learned that I wasn't the first driver to receive mysterious warnings over the CB radio. Several of the truckers had their own stories about voices that appeared on empty channels, providing information that turned out to be accurate but impossible to verify. Happened to me 3 years ago, said a driver named Pete. Voice warned me about a washout on Highway 50 in Nevada. Saved my life, probably. But when I tried to thank him, the channel was dead. State Patrol later told me I was the first driver to report the washout. Same thing happened to my cousin, added another driver. Someone warned him about a wrong-way driver on Interstate 25 in New Mexico. Perfect description of the car and license plate, but the accident hadn't happened yet when he got the warning. The stories went on through the night, voices that appeared on empty channels, warnings about accidents that were either about to happen or had just happened but hadn't been reported yet. Information that was always accurate but came from sources that shouldn't have existed. You know what I think? Said the woman who'd questioned me earlier. I think the road takes care of its own sometimes. Too many good drivers have died on these highways. Maybe some of them stick around to help the rest of us. It was a comforting thought, but it raised more questions than it answered. If the voice was some kind of spirit or ghost, how did it know about the accident before it was officially reported? How did it communicate through CB radios that other drivers couldn't hear? I never got answers to those questions. When the highway reopened around 6 a.m., I completed my run to Kansas City without incident. But I did drive past mile marker 247, where crews were still cleaning up the aftermath of the accident that had happened exactly as the voice had described. 4 cars and a pickup truck, just like Eastbound Charlie had said. If I hadn't received that warning, I would have hit that black ice at 70 miles per hour, adding my truck to the pile of twisted metal and probably killing myself and others in the process. Over the years since then, I've heard from other drivers who've had similar experiences. Mysterious voices on the CB providing warnings or assistance when it's needed most. Some drivers try to explain it rationally. Maybe it's radio signals bouncing off the atmosphere, carrying conversations from different times or locations. Others believe it's something supernatural. Me? I don't pretend to understand it. But I know that voice saved my life that night in Kansas, and I'm grateful for the warning, regardless of where it came from. The road can be a lonely, dangerous place, especially in bad weather. If there are guardian angels looking out for us drivers, even if they're the spirits of truckers who've gone before us, then I consider myself lucky to be under their protection. I still monitor Channel 19 religiously, especially during bad weather or when I'm traveling through remote areas. Most of the time, it's just the normal chatter of working drivers sharing information and keeping each other company. But sometimes, when conditions are just right and the need is great enough, I hear something else. A voice offering help when help is needed most. Clear, professional, and completely impossible to explain. I've learned to listen to those voices even when, especially when, no one else can hear them. Because out here on America's highways, you take help wherever you can find it, even if it comes from somewhere beyond the world we understand. The road has its own way of taking care of those who respect it. And sometimes the best way to show that respect is to trust in the voices that warn us away from danger, even when logic says they can't possibly exist. My name is Marcus Rodriguez, and I've been running freight through the Southwest for 12 years. I prefer the night runs. Less traffic, cooler temperatures, and a kind of peace you can only find when you're rolling down an empty highway under a sky full of stars. Most drivers hate the overnight hauls, but for me, there's no better time to be on the road. That preference almost got me killed on a stretch of asphalt that truckers call the Devil's Highway. It was September 2020, and I was hauling a load of construction equipment from Phoenix to Gallup, New Mexico. The most direct route would have taken me up Interstate 17 and across Interstate 40, but construction delays had that corridor backed up for miles. My dispatcher suggested taking Highway 191 north through the Navajo Nation, then cutting west on what used to be called Highway 666. Yeah, you heard that right. Highway 666, the Devil's Highway. They officially renamed it Highway 491 back in 2003, supposedly to reduce theft of road signs by people who thought the number was cool or creepy. But every trucker who runs that route still calls it by its old name. Some roads never shake their reputation, no matter what numbers you paint on the signs. The highway runs 200 miles through some of the most remote territory in the American Southwest. It cuts through the corner of Colorado, drops into New Mexico, and ends at the Arizona border. It's beautiful country during the day, red mesas, vast desert vistas, and distant mountain ranges that look like something from a Western movie. But at night, especially on moonless nights like this one, it becomes something else entirely. Something hostile. I'd driven Highway 666 dozens of times over the years, usually without incident. Sure, there were stories. There are always stories about roads with reputations like this one. Drivers claim to see things that shouldn't exist, hear voices on their CB radios speaking languages that hadn't been spoken in centuries, or experience mechanical failures that defied explanation. But I'd always chalked that up to the combination of isolation, fatigue, and too much coffee. That night I learned that some stories are more true than you want them to be. I entered the highway around 11 p.m. just north of Gallup. The night was clear and moonless, with more stars visible than you ever see near cities. My headlights carved a tunnel of white light through the darkness, illuminating the center line and shoulder of the two-lane road. The CB was quiet, not unusual for this remote stretch, and I had the highway completely to myself. For the first hour, it was exactly the kind of peaceful night drive I'd come to love. My truck's engine hummed contentedly, the miles rolled by steadily, and I found myself relaxing into the rhythm of the road. The desert landscape flowed past my windows like a black river, occasionally broken by the distant lights of a ranch house or the red eyes of radio towers blinking their warnings to aircraft. I should have known it was too peaceful to last. Around mile marker 78, about 60 miles north of Gallup, I saw the figure. At first, it was just a shadow at the edge of my headlight range, a dark silhouette standing beside the highway with one arm extended in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker seeking a ride. In that initial glimpse, it looked human enough, tall, wearing what appeared to be a long coat or jacket, thumb out toward the road. Hitchhikers aren't uncommon on remote highways, though they're usually a bad idea to pick up. Company policy strictly forbids giving rides to strangers, and even if it didn't, picking up hitchhikers in the middle of nowhere is asking for trouble. Too many drivers have ended up robbed, assaulted, or worse after showing kindness to someone stranded on the roadside. But as my headlights swept over this figure, something made me ease off the accelerator and take a longer look. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe some deeper instinct warning me that this wasn't a normal hitchhiker. Whatever the reason, I slowed from 70 to about 50 as I approached. That's when I realized the figure wasn't quite right. It was tall, maybe 6.5 feet, but it seemed to have no real substance. Instead of a person wearing dark clothing, it looked more like a human-shaped void in the landscape, a hole cut out of reality where a person should have been. My headlights illuminated everything around it clearly. The gravel shoulder, the metal fence posts, even individual tumbleweeds caught against the barbed wire. But the figure itself seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. As I got closer, I could see that it had no distinguishable features. No face, no details of clothing, just a vaguely human outline that stood perfectly still with one arm extended toward the road. It didn't move or react as my truck approached, didn't even seem to acknowledge my presence beyond maintaining that hitchhiker's pose. Every rational part of my brain told me to keep driving. Don't slow down, don't stop, don't even look back. Just maintain speed and get past whatever this thing was as quickly as possible. But I'd already slowed down too much, and now I was approaching the figure at a speed that made it impossible to ignore. 50 feet away, I could see that the shadow, and that's what it was, a shadow shaped like a person, had no feet. Its outline simply ended where the legs should have met the ground, as if it was somehow suspended an inch or two above the desert floor. The thumb extended toward traffic wasn't really a thumb at all, just a protrusion of darkness shaped roughly like a human digit. 25 feet away, I made a decision that probably saved my life. I pressed the accelerator and started to speed up, intending to get past this apparition as quickly as possible. But as my truck began to accelerate, the shadow figure moved for the first time. Its head, the area where a head should have been, turned to track my approach. Even though I couldn't see any features, couldn't make out eyes or a face, I felt it looking at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It was the same feeling you get when you're being watched by a predator, that primitive awareness that something dangerous has noticed you. I gunned the engine, pushing my speed back up towards 70. The figure was still tracking my movement, its head rotating smoothly to follow my truck as I passed. In my peripheral vision, I could see that arm still extended, still making that hitchhiking gesture, but now it seemed less like a request for help and more like a command to stop. I flew past the shadow at 75 miles per hour, my hands gripping the steering wheel hard enough to leave impressions in the plastic. In my side mirrors, I could see the figure receding into the distance, still standing at the roadside, still maintaining that ominous pose. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. I forced myself to exhale slowly and checked my CB radio, thinking maybe I should warn other drivers about the unusual situation. But Channel 19 was still silent, and I wasn't sure what I'd say anyway. Breaker 19, be advised there's a shadow person hitchhiking at mile marker 78 didn't sound like something a rational person would broadcast. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was an optical illusion caused by my headlights hitting a tree or rock formation at just the right angle. Maybe it was fatigue. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight, and the mind can play tricks when you're tired. Maybe it was just the power of suggestion, the result of too many campfire stories about the Devil's Highway. But deep down, I knew none of those explanations fit what I'd witnessed. That figure had been aware of me, had tracked my movement with intelligence and purpose. Whatever it was, it definitely wasn't natural. I spent the next 20 miles trying to put the encounter out of my mind, focusing on the road ahead and the steady rhythm of my engine. The CB remained silent, and I didn't see any other vehicles in either direction. It was just me, my truck, and the vast emptiness of the desert night. That's when I made the mistake of checking my mirrors. In the passenger side mirror, illuminated by the dim red glow of my trailer's taillights, I saw the shadow figure sitting in my passenger seat. I nearly jackknifed the truck. My hands jerked the wheel hard to the left, then overcorrected to the right as I fought to maintain control. The trailer swayed behind me, tires squealing against asphalt as I fought to keep the rig from rolling over. Somehow, through luck or skill or divine intervention, I managed to straighten out and keep the truck on the Beaubuzardia Ilonno road. My first instinct was to look directly at the passenger seat, to confirm what I'd seen in the mirror. But some survival instinct deeper than rational thought kept my eyes locked on the road ahead. "Don't look," a voice in my head screamed. "Whatever you do, don't look directly at it." Instead, I stole glances in the mirror. The shadow figure was definitely there, sitting motionless in my passenger seat like it belonged there. It had the same featureless, light-absorbing quality I'd observed on the roadside, but now I could see it was roughly human-sized and shaped. It sat upright, facing forward, hands apparently folded in its lap like a polite passenger waiting to reach its destination. The temperature in my cab had dropped at least 20 degrees. I could see my breath misting in the air, and frost was beginning to form on the inside of my windows. My truck's heater was running full blast, but it felt like I was driving through an Arctic wasteland instead of the New Mexico desert. "What do you want?" I whispered, not sure if I was talking to the thing in my cab or just trying to break the oppressive silence. The shadow figure didn't respond, didn't move, didn't acknowledge my question in any way. It simply sat there, radiating cold and an overwhelming sense of wrongness that made my skin crawl. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to stop the truck and run. But I was 60 miles from the nearest town in any direction. Running into the desert at night would be suicide, shadow figure, or no shadow figure. So I kept driving, maintaining my speed and trying to act like I wasn't sharing my cab with something that shouldn't exist. It was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Every few seconds I'd check the mirror to see if it was still there. It always was, sitting in exactly the same position, never moving, never changing. The worst part wasn't the cold or the fear, it was the smell. As the minutes passed, an odor began to fill the cab that I'd never experienced before and hope never to experience again. It wasn't the smell of decay or death exactly, but something older and more fundamental. It smelled like dust from places where nothing had ever lived, like air that had never been breathed, like the emptiness between stars. My CB radio, which had been silent all night, suddenly crackled to life. "Driver," a voice said. Not the voice of the shadow figure. This sound came from the radio speaker, distorted by static but recognizably human. "Driver, you need to get off this highway. Now." I grabbed my microphone with a shaking hand. "Who is this?" "What's your 20? "Mile marker 95, northbound. I can see your truck approaching. You've got something in your cab that doesn't belong there." I checked my odometer. Mile marker 95 was about 2 miles ahead. Someone was watching me, could see my truck, and apparently could see inside my cab as well. That should have been comforting. Help was ahead, but instead it terrified me even more. "Copy that. What am I dealing with here?" "Shadow hitcher. They're drawn to solo drivers on this stretch of highway. Usually they just ride along for a few miles, then disappear, but sometimes... The voice trailed off into static. Sometimes what? I demanded. What happens sometimes? The static cleared, and when the voice returned, it was filled with dread. Sometimes they don't get out. Sometimes they follow you home. The shadow figure moved for the first time since appearing in my cab. Its head turned slowly toward the CB radio, then toward me. I still couldn't make out any features, but I felt the weight of its attention like a physical presence. It was no longer ignoring me. How do I get rid of it? I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. There's a truck stop at mile marker 98, but it's been closed for years. Pull in there and kill your engine. Don't get out, don't look directly at it, just sit there and wait. Sometimes they'll leave on their own if you stop moving. And if it doesn't leave? More static. When the voice returned, it was fainter, like the speaker was moving away from his radio. Then you pray, driver. You pray real hard. Mile marker 95 came and went, but I didn't see any other trucks or any sign of whoever had been talking to me on the radio. The highway remained empty except for my rig and its unwanted passenger. The CB fell silent again, leaving me alone with the shadow figure and the growing cold. Mile marker 98 appeared in my headlights, along with the ruins of what had once been a truck stop. The building was dark and obviously abandoned, with boarded-up windows and weeds growing through cracks in the parking lot. A faded sign still advertised fuel and food, but the prices listed were from the 1980s. I pulled into the cracked parking lot and brought my truck to a stop near what used to be the fuel islands. The pumps were still standing, but obviously non-functional, their displays dark and their hoses coiled like sleeping snakes. I shifted into park and turned off the engine as instructed. The sudden silence was deafening. Without the constant rumble of the diesel engine, every small sound seemed amplified. The ticking of cooling metal, the whisper of wind through broken windows, the settling of my truck's suspension. And underneath it all, a sound I couldn't quite identify, like distant breathing or the rustling of dry leaves. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. The shadow figure remained motionless in the passenger seat, but I could feel its presence intensifying, becoming more solid and real with each passing moment. The cold was so severe now that ice was forming on the inside of my windshield and my breath came out in thick clouds. Then without warning it spoke. Not through the CB radio, not in words I could understand, but directly into my mind. The voice was like wine through empty places, like the sound of sand falling into deep holes, like whispers in languages that had never been human. You stopped, it said, and somehow I understood the meaning even though the words weren't really words. You listened. You showed respect. I just want to get home, I replied, not sure if I was speaking aloud or just thinking the words. Home, it repeated, and there was something like amusement in that alien voice. Yes, everyone wants to go home, even those who have no home left to return to. The shadow figure began to change, becoming less solid and more transparent. Through its fading form, I could see the abandoned truck stop and the empty highway beyond. The temperature in my cab started to return to normal and the oppressive sense of wrongness began to lift. You drive the night roads, it continued, its voice growing fainter as its form dissolved. You understand the darkness. Be careful, driver. Not all shadows are as considerate as I am. And then it was gone, leaving behind only the lingering smell of that otherworldly dust and a passenger seat that looked like it had never been occupied. I sat there for another few minutes, making sure it was really gone before starting my engine. The diesel rumbled to life normally, my heater began pushing warm air through the cab, and my CB crackled with distant conversations from truckers hundreds of miles away. Everything was back to normal, or as normal as anything gets on the Devil's Highway. I completed my run to Phoenix without any further incidents, but I couldn't shake the memory of that encounter. Over the following weeks, I found myself researching the history of Highway 666, looking for explanations or similar experiences. What I found wasn't reassuring. The highway had been the site of dozens of unexplained accidents over the years. Drivers reported seeing figures on the roadside that weren't there when they looked back. Others described passengers who appeared in their vehicles without warning, only to vanish just as mysteriously. There were stories of trucks found abandoned in the desert with no sign of their drivers, and tales of people who entered the highway and were never seen again. The Native American communities in the area had their own stories about the route, speaking of spirits that wandered the empty places between settlements, looking for travelers to guide or mislead. Some of these spirits were benevolent, they said, offering help to lost souls trying to find their way home. Others were not so kind. I learned that the abandoned truck stop where I'd encountered the shadow figure had been closed since 1987, after a series of incidents involving drivers who claimed to see things that shouldn't exist. The final straw had been a trucker who'd stopped for fuel and never left. His truck was found running in the parking lot, but he'd simply vanished without a trace. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that I'd had a genuine encounter with something supernatural on that lonely stretch of highway. But unlike many of the stories I read, my experience had ended without tragedy. The shadow figure had been curious rather than malevolent, and had ultimately left me unharmed. I think it was because I'd shown respect. I hadn't tried to run it off the road or challenge its presence. I'd simply accepted that I was sharing my space with something I didn't understand, and I'd followed the advice of the mysterious voice on the CB radio. I still drive Highway 666 occasionally, though never by choice. Sometimes dispatchers route loads that way, and I don't argue. I've learned that some roads choose you as much as you choose them. But I'm more careful now, more aware of my surroundings and more respectful of the empty places between towns. And I always keep my CB radio on channel 19 just in case someone needs to warn me about what's waiting up ahead in the darkness. The last time I drove through that stretch, I stopped at the abandoned truck stop again. Not because I had to, but because something told me I should. I sat there in my idling truck for a few minutes, listening to the wind and watching the shadows move through the ruins. Just before I left, I heard that voice again, not on the radio this time, but carried on the desert wind. "Safe travels, driver," it whispered. "Thank you for understanding." I put my truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, heading north toward home. In my mirrors, I could see a tall shadow standing among the ruins, one arm raised in what might have been a wave goodbye. Some hitchhikers, I've learned, aren't looking for a ride to somewhere else. They're just looking for a moment of connection, a brief reminder that they haven't been completely forgotten by the living world. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is simply stop and acknowledge that they exist, even if you can't take them where they want to go. I'm Tommy Williams, but everyone on the CB calls me Big Rig. I've been hauling freight for 18 years, mostly running the southwestern routes where the heat can kill you in summer and the isolation can drive you crazy year-round. I thought I'd seen everything these desert highways could throw at a driver, until I encountered something on Interstate 10 that still haunts my dreams 3 years later. It was August 2021, and I was running a load of auto parts from Phoenix to Tucson on what should have been a routine night run. The daytime temperatures that week had been pushing 118 degrees, hot enough to melt the soles off your boots if you stood on asphalt too long. Even at 11 p.m., the thermometer on my dashboard was reading 94 degrees, and the desert air shimmered with heat waves that made the horizon dance like liquid. I-10 through southern Arizona is a trucker's highway, 4 lanes of straight, flat road, cutting through some of the most unforgiving landscape in North America. It's the kind of route where you can set your cruise control and let your mind wander, watching the endless parade of saguaro cacti and mountain ranges scroll past your windows. Most drivers find it boring. I've always found it peaceful, especially at night when the traffic thins out and you've got miles of highway to yourself. That night started like any other. I'd loaded up in Phoenix around 9 p.m., grabbed a quick shower and a decent meal at the truck stop, and hit the road feeling good. My truck was running well. My logbook had plenty of hours left, and the load was light enough that I could maintain highway speeds without straining the engine. It was shaping up to be one of those easy runs that remind you why you became a trucker in the first place. The first sign that something was wrong came around mile marker 156, about 50 miles southeast of Phoenix. I was cruising along at 70 miles per hour, listening to classic country on the radio and enjoying the relative cool of the night air, when I noticed something moving in my peripheral vision. At first, I thought it was just another vehicle passing me. Maybe a car with bright headlights or a motorcycle with one of those excessive light bars that some riders use. But when I glanced in my mirrors, there were no other vehicles in sight. The highway stretched empty behind me, illuminated only by my own taillights reflecting off the reflective lane markers. I looked to my right toward the source of the movement, and that's when I saw him. Running alongside my truck, matching my 70-mile-per-hour pace exactly, was a man on fire. Not a man who had been burned, not someone whose clothes were smoldering, but a human figure completely engulfed in flames from head to toe. The fire wasn't the orange and yellow of a normal blaze, but a brilliant white that was almost too bright to look at directly. It outlined every detail of his body, arms pumping in perfect running form, legs stretching in long, ground-eating strides, head held high like a marathon runner in perfect condition. He was running in the desert beside the highway, weaving between cacti and jumping over rocks with impossible grace. But what terrified me most wasn't the fact that he was on fire. It was that he was keeping pace with a 70-mile-per-hour truck without apparent effort. No human being can run that fast, especially not while burning alive. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. He was still there, still running, still burning with that terrible white fire. The flames streamed behind him like a comet's tail, leaving brief after-images burned into my retinas. But there was no smoke, no heat distortion, no sign that anything was actually burning except for the figure itself. My first rational thought was that I was hallucinating. Heat exhaustion can cause vivid visions, and even though I was inside an air-conditioned cab, I'd been exposed to extreme temperatures while loading in Phoenix. Maybe I was more affected than I'd realized, but the figure looked too real, too detailed to be a hallucination. I could see individual flames dancing along his arms and legs, could make out the muscles in his back working as he ran. This wasn't some vague, dreamlike vision. It was as clear and detailed as anything I'd ever seen. I eased off the throttle, slowing from 70 to 60 miles per hour. The burning man slowed with me, maintaining his position alongside my truck with mechanical precision. When I sped back up to 70, he accelerated as well, never falling behind or pulling ahead. That's when I realized he wasn't just running beside the highway. He was running with me, specifically. Following my truck, matching my speed, staying in my peripheral vision like some kind of fiery escort. I grabbed my CB microphone with hands that were starting to shake. Breaker 19. This is Big Rig southbound on I-10 at mile marker 158. Anyone else seeing anything unusual out here tonight? The response came immediately from another trucker about 10 miles ahead of me. Big Rig, this is eastbound Eddie. What kind of unusual are we talking about? I hesitated. How do you explain that you're being paced by a man on fire? Got someone running alongside my truck. Looks like they might be in distress. Copy that, Big Rig. You want me to call for emergency services? I looked to my right again. The burning figure was still there, still running with that impossible speed and grace. Up close, I could see more details that made no sense. His face was clearly visible through the flames, and he didn't look like someone in distress. His expression was calm, almost serene, like a marathon runner in the zone. His mouth wasn't open in a scream of pain. It was closed in a slight smile. Negative, Eddie. I don't think he needs help. There was a pause on the radio. Big Rig, you feeling okay out there? Maybe you should pull over and take a break. Maybe Eddie was right. Maybe I was more tired than I'd realized, or maybe the heat had gotten to me more than I'd thought. But as I considered pulling over, the burning man turned his head and looked directly at me. His eyes were the same brilliant white as the flames consuming his body, but they were undeniably human eyes. They showed intelligence, awareness, and something that might have been amusement. He nodded once, as if acknowledging my attention, then turned back to his running. That nod convinced me that whatever I was seeing, it wasn't a hallucination. Hallucinations don't interact with you, don't show awareness of your presence. This thing, whatever it was, knew I was there and was deliberately putting on a show for my benefit. I decided to test my theory. Without warning, I hit the brakes and slowed to 50 miles per hour. The burning man slowed with me, instantly, never missing a stride. I accelerated back to 70, then pushed it to 75. He matched every speed change perfectly, as if he was connected to my truck by an invisible cable. Okay, I said aloud, not sure if I was talking to the figure or to myself. What do you want? The burning man turned his head toward me again, and this time his smile was clearly visible through the flames. He raised one burning hand in what looked like a wave, then suddenly veered away from the highway, running off into the desert at an angle that would take him away from the road. I thought that was the end of it. Whatever strange encounter I'd just experienced was over, and I could get back to the business of driving my load to Tucson. I settled back into my seat and tried to convince myself that the whole thing had been some kind of optical illusion or heat-induced vision. But the burning man wasn't done with me yet. About 10 minutes later, he reappeared on my left side, running in the median between the eastbound and westbound lanes of Interstate 10. This time he was closer to the road, close enough that my headlights illuminated him clearly. The flames were even brighter now, so intense that they cast shadows on the desert floor around him. He ran alongside my truck for another few minutes, then suddenly cut across the median and disappeared into the darkness on the far side of the eastbound lanes. I lost sight of him behind a low hill, but I could see the glow of his flames reflecting off the rocks and cacti for several more seconds. That's when I smelled the smoke. It started as just a faint odor, the kind you might notice if someone was having a barbecue in the distance. But it quickly grew stronger, filling my cab with the acrid scent of burning. Something. Not wood, not gasoline, not plastic, but something organic that I couldn't identify. It smelled like burning hair mixed with ozone and desert sage. I checked all my gauges, looking for signs of mechanical trouble. Engine temperature was normal, oil pressure was good. All electrical systems were functioning properly. There was no reason for my truck to be producing smoke, but the smell was definitely coming from inside my cab. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Ash was falling inside my truck. Not a lot at first, just a few gray flakes drifting down from the ceiling like snow. But within minutes it was falling steadily, covering my dashboard and settling on my clothes. I reached up to touch the headliner, thinking maybe something was wrong with my air conditioning system, but the fabric was clean and dry. The ash was appearing out of nowhere, materializing in the air inside my cab and drifting down like the aftermath of a fire that existed in some other dimension. When I caught some of the flakes in my hand, they felt real enough, gritty and warm, with that distinctive texture of burnt organic matter. I pulled over at the next exit, a remote interchange that served a small desert community called 3 Points. The truck stop there was little more than a gas station with a few parking spaces for big rigs, but it had enough light for me to inspect my truck thoroughly. What I found defied explanation. The exterior of my truck and trailer showed no signs of fire damage, no scorch marks or heat warping. But when I opened the hood to check the engine compartment, I found a thin layer of ash coating everything. The engine block, the radiator, the air filter housing. It was the same gray ash that had been falling in my cab, and it was definitely not something that could have come from my diesel engine. More disturbing was the smell. The acrid burning odor was strongest near the front of my truck, as if something had been on fire very close to my bumper and grill. But there was no evidence of any actual fire, no source for the smoke I'd smelled or the ash I'd found. I spent 20 minutes going over every inch of my rig looking for some rational explanation. Maybe I'd driven through smoke from a brush fire without realizing it. Maybe there'd been an accident up ahead that I hadn't seen. Maybe my air conditioning system had malfunctioned in some weird way. But deep down, I knew the truth. The burning man had left his mark on my truck, physical evidence of an encounter that shouldn't have been possible. Whatever he was, hallucination, ghost, or something else entirely, he'd interacted with the physical world in a way that left traces behind. I climbed back into my cab and tried to radio eastbound Eddie, the driver who'd talked to me earlier. But Channel 19 was dead quiet now. Not even the usual late-night chatter from insomniacs and night owls. It was like every trucker on I-10 had suddenly vanished, leaving me alone with whatever was happening in the desert. The rest of the drive to Tucson was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few minutes I'd catch a glimpse of light in my peripheral vision and think the burning man was back. But it always turned out to be a distant radio tower or the reflection of my own headlights off a road sign. The ash stopped falling about halfway to Tucson, and the burning smell gradually faded until my cab smelled normal again. By the time I reached my destination, I'd almost convinced myself that the whole encounter had been some kind of elaborate hallucination brought on by heat, fatigue, or a combination of both. But when I backed up to the loading dock and shut down my engine, the dock worker who came out to check my paperwork stopped and stared at my truck with a puzzled expression. "Jesus, driver, what happened to your rig? Looks like you drove through a fire?" I climbed out and looked at my truck from his perspective. In the bright lights of the loading dock, I could see what he was talking about. My truck and trailer were covered in a fine layer of ash, concentrated, heavily on the front end but extending all the way back to the rear doors of my trailer. It looked exactly like what you'd expect from a vehicle that had driven through heavy smoke. "I honestly don't know," I told him, which was the truth. Didn't see any fires on the highway. He helped me back the trailer into the dock, but I could tell he thought I was lying or hiding something. Drivers don't usually show up looking like they've been through a wildfire without a good story to explain it. Over the next few days, I talked to other drivers about my experience, trying to find someone else who'd encountered something similar on Interstate 10. What I learned was both comforting and terrifying. I wasn't the only one. Over the years, dozens of truckers had reported seeing a burning figure running alongside their trucks on that stretch of highway. The descriptions were always similar: a man completely engulfed in brilliant white flames running at impossible speeds, showing no signs of distress or pain. Some drivers said he'd paced them for miles before disappearing. Others reported brief encounters that lasted only a few minutes. But I was one of the few who'd experienced the physical effects. The ash, the smoke smell, the evidence that the encounter had been more than just a vision. Most drivers just saw the figure and then it vanished, leaving them to wonder if they'd imagined the whole thing. One old-timer at a truck stop in Flagstaff told me a story that sent chills down my spine. According to him, the burning man had been seen on Interstate 10 since the highway opened in the 1960s. But the sightings had increased dramatically after a tanker truck carrying gasoline had rolled over and exploded near mile marker 156 in 1978, killing the driver instantly. Some say it's the ghost of that driver, the old-timer explained. Still making his run, still trying to deliver his load even though he's been dead for decades. Others think it's something else entirely, some kind of desert spirit that feeds on the heat and the loneliness of the road. I don't know which explanation is true, if either of them is. All I know is that I encountered something on Interstate 10 that night that defied every rational explanation I could think of. Whether it was the ghost of a dead trucker or something even stranger, it left physical evidence of its existence in the form of ash and scorch marks that couldn't be explained away. I still run I-10 regularly. It's one of the major freight corridors in the Southwest, and you can't avoid it if you want to make a living hauling loads in this part of the country. But I'm more careful now. More aware of my surroundings and more respectful of the strange things that can happen on lonely desert highways. I've never seen the burning man again, though I've felt his presence a few times. That subtle sense of being watched, the faint smell of smoke when there's no visible fire, the occasional glimpse of light in my peripheral vision that disappears when I turn to look directly at it. Other drivers have told me they've spotted him since my encounter, still running alongside trucks on that same stretch of highway, still burning with that brilliant white fire. He seems to be drawn to solo drivers making night runs, perhaps offering some kind of companionship to those brave or foolish enough to traverse the desert darkness alone. I like to think he's benevolent, that burning ghost or spirit or whatever he is. He never tried to harm me, never caused my truck to malfunction or led me off the road. He just ran alongside me for a while, sharing the highway with a living driver who was making the same journey he'd been making for decades. Maybe that's all any of us really want in the end. Someone to share the road with. Someone who understands the loneliness and isolation of the long haul. Even if that someone happens to be on fire and running at 70 miles per hour through the Arizona desert. The road can be a lonely place, especially at night in the middle of nowhere. If there are spirits out there keeping us company, watching over us as we make our runs through the darkness, then maybe that's not such a terrible thing. Sometimes the dead are better companions than the living. At least they understand what it means to be truly alone. My name is Betty Nash, and I've been driving truck for 27 years. Started when I was 25, right after my divorce, looking for a way to make good money and see the country at the same time. Back then, there weren't many women in the trucking business, but I was stubborn enough to prove I belonged on the road just as much as any man. Over the years, I've developed a reputation for reliability. I deliver my loads on time, I don't cause trouble at truck stops, and I follow the hours of service regulations religiously. That last part is important. Those HOS rules aren't just bureaucratic nonsense. They're designed to keep tired drivers off the road, and tired drivers kill people. Which is why what happened to me on I-55 in central Illinois still doesn't make sense 3 years later. It was November 2020, and I was running a load of electronics from Chicago to Memphis. The route takes you down I-55 through some of the flattest, most monotonous farmland in America. Mile after mile of harvested cornfields stretching to the horizon, broken only by the occasional grain elevator or small town. It's not scenic, but it's efficient, and efficiency matters when you're trying to make a living hauling freight. I'd left Chicago around 2 p.m., planning to drive straight through to Memphis and deliver first thing in the morning. It was a tight schedule, but doable, as long as I didn't run into weather or traffic delays. The November weather was cooperating. Clear skies, light winds, and temperatures in the low 40s. Perfect driving conditions. The problem started around 10 p.m., about 50 miles south of Springfield. I'd been making good time, staying ahead of schedule despite the usual construction slowdowns around the bigger cities. But I was starting to feel the effects of a long day. That subtle heaviness in my eyelids, the slight drift in concentration that every professional driver learns to recognize as a warning sign. I checked my logbook and calculated my remaining drive time. According to the federal hours of service regulations, I had exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes left before I'd be required to take a 10-hour rest break. That should have been enough time to reach Memphis, but only if I pushed straight through without stopping. The smart thing would have been to find a truck stop and take a short nap, maybe 30 minutes to recharge my batteries. But I was eager to get this load delivered and start my weekend, and Memphis was so close I could almost taste it. I decided to push through, figuring I could rely on coffee and adrenaline to keep me alert for the final stretch. That decision nearly cost me my life. By 11:30 p.m. I was struggling to stay awake. My head was nodding, my eyes were burning, and I'd caught myself drifting toward the shoulder twice in the past 10 minutes. Every responsible part of my brain was screaming at me to find a place to pull over, but there were no truck stops on this stretch of I-55, just small towns with no facilities for commercial vehicles. I was debating whether to pull into a rest area and try to catch a quick nap in my sleeper berth when I saw the lights ahead. At first, I thought it was just another truck stop, one of the big chain operations that cater to professional drivers with fuel, food, and parking. But as I got closer, I realized this place was bigger and brighter than most. The sign read Prairie View Travel Plaza in cheerful blue letters, and the parking lot was lit up like daylight by dozens of overhead fixtures. I'd never heard of Prairie View Travel Plaza, but that didn't mean much. New truck stops open all the time, especially along major freight corridors like I-55, and frankly, I was too tired to care about the details. All that mattered was that they had a place for me to park and maybe grab a quick shower and a hot meal. I pulled off at the exit and navigated into the parking lot. The facility was impressive, easily 50 parking spaces for big rigs plus additional spots for cars and RVs. The main building looked modern and well-maintained, with large windows that revealed a brightly lit interior. I could see vending machines, restaurant seating, and what looked like a small convenience store. The weird thing was that the parking lot was almost empty. At 11:45 p.m. on a Friday night, a truck stop this size should have been packed with drivers taking their mandatory rest breaks or stopping for fuel and food. But I counted only 3 other big rigs in the lot, and they were parked in the dark corners where their drivers were probably asleep. I found a good parking spot near the front of the building and shut down my engine. The sudden silence was almost overwhelming after hours of road noise and diesel rumble. I sat in my cab for a moment, stretching my back and checking my logbook one more time. I had about 90 minutes left on my drive clock, enough time for a quick meal and maybe a 20-minute power nap. The main building looked inviting through my windshield. Bright, clean, modern, with the kind of fluorescent lighting that promised hot food and strong coffee. I grabbed my wallet and jacket and headed inside, looking forward to stretching my legs and getting some caffeine in my system. The interior of the travel plaza was even more impressive than the outside. The floors were polished tile, the walls were painted in warm earth tones, and everything looked brand new. There was a full-service restaurant with booth seating, a convenience store stocked with all the usual road snacks, and a bank of vending machines offering everything from sodas to shower tokens. But the place was completely deserted, not just quiet, completely empty of human presence. The lights were on, the vending machines were humming, and I could hear soft music playing from speakers in the ceiling. But there wasn't a single employee behind the counter. No other customers browsing the aisles, no one at all. "Hello?" I called out, thinking maybe the staff was in the back room or the restaurant kitchen. "Anybody here?" My voice echoed strangely in the empty space, but no one answered. I walked over to the restaurant area and checked the posted hours. According to the sign, they were open 24/7, but the serving area was dark and the coffee pots were empty. I tried the convenience store next. The shelves were fully stocked with snacks, drinks, and trucking supplies. The prices seemed reasonable, even a little low by current standards. But there was no one manning the register, no way to actually purchase anything. The vending machines were a different story. They were all fully operational, brightly lit, and well-stocked with sodas, energy drinks, and packaged snacks. I fed a $5 bill into one of them and selected a Mountain Dew, more for the caffeine than because I was thirsty. The machine accepted my money and dispensed the drink normally, which should have been reassuring, but somehow made the whole situation even more unsettling. I popped open the soda and took a long drink, trying to figure out what was going on. Maybe the overnight staff had stepped out for a few minutes. Maybe there'd been some kind of emergency that required all the employees to leave at once. Maybe the place was transitioning between shifts and the new crew hadn't arrived yet. But even as I ran through the possibilities, none of them felt right. This felt like something else entirely. Like I'd stumbled into a place that was designed to look normal but definitely wasn't. I decided to use the restroom and then head back to my truck. Whatever was going on here, I didn't want to be part of it. I'd find another place to stop, maybe one of the smaller operations I'd passed earlier. The restroom was as clean and well-maintained as the rest of the facility, with working plumbing and plenty of supplies. But when I looked in the mirror above the sink, I got my first real indication that something was seriously wrong. My reflection looked normal enough, but behind me I could see the restroom door standing wide open. The problem was, I distinctly remembered closing that door when I'd entered. I turned around to look directly at the door, and it was indeed closed just as I'd left it. But in the mirror it remained open, showing a view of the empty convenience store beyond. I stared at the mirror for a long moment, trying to process what I was seeing. Mirrors don't lie, they reflect what's actually there. But this one seemed to be showing me a different version of reality, one where doors that should be closed were standing open. I turned back to the sink, avoiding eye contact with my own reflection, and quickly finished washing my hands. Whatever was happening in this place, I needed to get back to my truck and get the hell out of here. My fatigue was forgotten, replaced by a growing sense that I'd wandered into something that wasn't meant for living people to see. As I walked back through the convenience store toward the exit, I noticed other details that I'd missed on my way in. The magazines in the rack were all current issues, but the dates seemed slightly off. Not wrong exactly, but somehow not quite right. The newspapers in the stand were from today's date, but the headlines described events I'd never heard of. The lottery ticket display showed jackpot amounts that didn't match what I'd seen advertised on billboards earlier that evening. It was like someone had created a nearly perfect replica of a normal truck stop, but had gotten some of the details wrong. Close enough to fool a casual observer, but wrong enough to trigger that subliminal awareness that something wasn't right. I reached the front door and pushed it open, eager to get back to the familiar comfort of my truck. But when I stepped outside, my blood turned to ice water. My truck wasn't there. The parking space where I'd left my rig was empty. Not just empty, completely undisturbed, as if no vehicle had ever been parked there at all. The asphalt was dry and clean, without the usual oil stains or tire marks that accumulate wherever trucks regularly park. I ran to the spot where I was certain I'd left my truck, looking for some sign that it had been there. Maybe someone had stolen it, though truck theft is rare and requires considerable skill to pull off. Maybe I'd misremembered which space I'd used, though I'd been parking trucks for 27 years and had never made that kind of mistake. But as I searched the entire parking lot, the truth became unavoidable. My truck wasn't just missing, it had never been there at all. The few other big rigs I'd seen when I arrived were gone too, leaving the lot completely empty except for my own footprints in the thin layer of dust that covered the asphalt. Panic started to set in. I was stranded in the middle of rural Illinois with no transportation, no way to call for help, and apparently no way to prove that I'd ever had a truck to begin with. My wallet was still in my jacket pocket along with my driver's license and CDL. But what good would they do me if I couldn't find my rig? I ran back toward the building thinking maybe I could use a phone to call my company's dispatch office or contact the police. But when I reached for the door handle, it wouldn't budge. The door that had opened easily just minutes before was now locked tight, as if the building had sealed itself against me. Through the windows, I could see that the lights were still on, the vending machines were still humming, and everything looked exactly as it had when I'd been inside. But the door remained immovably locked, and no amount of pounding or shouting brought any response from within. That's when I noticed that the sign had changed. Instead of Prairie View Travel Plaza, it now read Prairie View Restaurant, closed since 1987. The cheerful blue letters had faded to a weathered gray, and rust stains had appeared around the mounting brackets. The building itself looked different too, older, more weathered, with boarded-up windows and weeds growing through cracks in the foundation. I staggered backward, trying to process what I was seeing. The bright modern travel plaza had transformed into the ruins of an abandoned restaurant that had obviously been closed for decades. The parking lot that had been clean and well lit was now cracked and overgrown, with grass pushing up through the asphalt and potholes that would challenge even the most skilled driver. But the most terrifying realization was that I was no longer on the highway. When I'd pulled into the travel plaza, it had been just off I-55, easily visible from the interstate and clearly accessible via a standard exit ramp. Now, as I looked around in growing desperation, I found myself in the middle of what appeared to be farmland, surrounded by empty fields that stretched to the horizon in every direction. There was no highway, no exit ramp, no road of any kind. Just the abandoned ruins of an old restaurant sitting in the middle of nowhere, as if it had been dropped there by some cosmic accident. I pulled out my cell phone hoping to get a GPS fix on my location or at least call for help. But the screen showed no signal, not even the single bar I usually got in rural areas. According to the phone's GPS, my location was listed simply as unknown, which shouldn't have been possible for a modern smartphone with satellite connectivity. I started walking, picking a direction at random and hoping to find some sign of civilization. The ground was uneven and rough, covered with the stubble of harvested corn and broken by drainage ditches that forced me to make frequent detours. My feet weren't designed for cross-country hiking. I was wearing the comfortable walking shoes that most truckers prefer, not boots suitable for traversing farmland. For what felt like hours, I walked across those empty fields, calling out occasionally in the hope that someone might hear me. But the only sounds were the wind rustling through the corn stubble and the distant hoot of an owl. The night was clear and cold, with more stars visible than I'd seen in years. But that celestial beauty did nothing to ease my growing terror. I was lost in a way that shouldn't have been possible. I'd simply walked into a truck stop for a soda and a bathroom break, and somehow ended up stranded in the middle of farmland with no memory of how I'd gotten there and no way to get back to where I belonged. As I walked, I tried to reconstruct the evening's events, looking for some logical explanation for what had happened. Maybe I'd fallen asleep at the wheel and crashed, and this was all some kind of coma-induced hallucination. Maybe I'd had a stroke or heart attack and was lying unconscious in a hospital somewhere. Maybe I'd been drugged or kidnapped, though I couldn't imagine why anyone would go to such elaborate lengths to strand a truck driver in the middle of nowhere. But none of those explanations felt right. I felt alert and aware, my thinking was clear, and I had no sense of physical injury or illness. Whatever had happened to me, it wasn't a medical emergency or a simple case of getting lost. I'd been walking for maybe an hour when I saw the lights ahead. At first I thought it was just another farmhouse, maybe with a phone I could use to call for help. But as I got closer, the lights resolved into the familiar pattern of a truck stop. Fuel islands, overhead canopies, and the distinctive glow of a building designed to serve commercial drivers 24 hours a day. It was I-55, or at least a highway that looked like I-55, with the steady stream of headlights that marked a major freight corridor. Relief flooded through me as I realized I'd somehow found my way back to civilization. Maybe I could catch a ride with another driver, or at least use a phone to call my dispatch office and report my truck stolen. But as I approached the truck stop, I realized it was the same building I'd visited earlier. Prairie View Travel Plaza, looking exactly as it had when I'd first seen it. Bright, modern, well-maintained, with a parking lot full of big rigs and the promise of food, fuel, and communication with the outside world. My truck was there too, parked in the exact same spot where I'd left it, looking none the worse for its mysterious disappearance. The engine was still warm when I touched the hood, and my logbook was still on the passenger seat exactly where I'd left it. I climbed into the cab and sat there for several minutes, trying to make sense of what had just happened. According to my dashboard clock, I'd been gone for exactly 23 minutes, not the hours I'd spent walking across empty farmland, but less than half an hour. My logbook showed that I still had over an hour left on my driving time, just as I'd calculated before entering the building. But I knew what I'd experienced. I'd walked for miles across farmland that shouldn't have existed, searching for a highway that had somehow vanished, only to find myself back where I'd started as if nothing had ever happened. I started my engine and pulled back onto Interstate 55, eager to put as much distance as possible between myself and Prairie View Travel Plaza. In my mirrors, I could see the bright lights of the facility receding into the distance, looking perfectly normal and innocent. But when I checked my GPS to mark the location, it showed nothing but empty farmland at those coordinates. According to the satellite view, there was no truck stop, no exit ramp, no buildings of any kind in that area. Just the same endless cornfields that stretched across central Illinois. Over the next few weeks, I researched that stretch of Interstate 55, trying to find some record of Prairie View Travel Plaza. What I discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. There had indeed been a restaurant called Prairie View at roughly that location, built in the early 1960s to serve travelers on the then new interstate highway. It had been a popular stop for truckers and families for over 2 decades, known for good food and friendly service. But the restaurant had closed in 1987 after a series of strange incidents. Customers reported getting lost in the building, finding rooms and corridors that hadn't been there before, or discovering that their vehicles had moved to different parking spots while they were inside. Some visitors claimed to have spent hours in the restaurant only to discover that only minutes had passed in the outside world. The final straw had been a family of 4 who'd stopped for dinner and simply vanished. Their car was found in the parking lot with the engine still running, but despite extensive searches, no trace of the missing family was ever discovered. The restaurant closed permanently soon after, and the building was demolished in 1991. But according to dozens of reports I found online, Prairie View Travel Plaza still appears to travelers on I-55, usually late at night and usually to people who are tired, lost, or in distress. Some visitors like me manage to find their way back to the normal world. Others aren't so lucky. I never reported my experience to the police or to my company. Who would have believed such a story? A truck driver claims she stopped at a travel plaza that's been closed for 30 years, got stranded in farmland that doesn't exist, and found her way back by walking through fields that aren't on any map. They'd have ordered a psychological evaluation and probably suspended my CDL. Instead, I filed it away as one of those unexplained experiences that every long-haul driver accumulates over the years. The road is full of strange places and impossible encounters, and sometimes the best thing you can do is accept them and move on. But I never drive that stretch of I-55 late at night anymore. And when other drivers tell me stories about mysterious truck stops that appear and disappear or rest areas that exist in some other dimension, I listen with the respect those stories deserve. Because sometimes the road offers you exactly what you need: a place to rest, a hot meal, a moment of comfort in the middle of a long journey. But sometimes that generosity comes with a price, and that price might be higher than you're prepared to pay. The Prairie View Travel Plaza gave me what I was looking for that night: a break from the monotony of driving, a chance to stretch my legs and clear my head. But it also showed me that there are places between here and there that exist outside the normal rules of space and time. Places where time moves differently, where buildings can be new and old simultaneously, where you can walk for hours and end up exactly where you started. Places that cater to travelers who've lost their way, not just geographically, but in some deeper, more fundamental sense. I completed my run to Memphis without any further incidents, delivered my load on time, and went home to enjoy my weekend. But I've never forgotten those 23 minutes I spent in a place that shouldn't have existed, walking across farmland that wasn't there, searching for a highway that had temporarily vanished from reality. The road has its own geography, its own rules, its own destinations that don't appear on any official map. Sometimes the best thing you can do is follow where it leads, even when it takes you somewhere impossible. And sometimes the wisest thing you can do is find your way back to the world you know and never speak of where you've been. I'm Mike Peterson, but everyone calls me Mountain Mike because I specialize in running loads through the Rocky Mountains. Been doing it for 19 years, ever since I got out of the Army and decided I wanted a job that would let me see some of the most beautiful country in America. The mountain passes of Wyoming, Colorado, and Montana can be treacherous, especially in winter, but they're also some of the most spectacular drives you'll find anywhere. The downside of specializing in mountain routes is that you spend a lot of time dealing with conditions that can kill you if you make a mistake. Ice, snow, high winds, steep grades, and switchback curves that would challenge a sports car, let alone an 80,000-pound tractor-trailer combination. You learn to read the weather, respect the terrain, and never ever take unnecessary risks. That's what made what happened on Teton Pass so disturbing. I did everything right, followed all the safety protocols I'd developed over nearly 2 decades of mountain driving. But somehow, I still found myself in a situation that defied every law of physics and logic I thought I understood. It was January 2019, and I was hauling a load of machinery parts from Salt Lake City to Jackson, Wyoming. The route takes you over Teton Pass, an 8,431-foot mountain crossing that's notorious for challenging even experienced drivers. The pass has a 10% grade on the western side, with switchback curves and limited visibility that demand constant attention and perfect vehicle control. Winter conditions make it even more dangerous. Snow can fall without warning, creating ice patches that turn a routine descent into a life-or-death struggle for control. The Wyoming Department of Transportation closes the pass regularly during severe weather, and when they do reopen it, they often require chains on all commercial vehicles. I'd been monitoring the weather reports for 3 days before my scheduled departure, and conditions looked marginal but manageable. A winter storm had passed through the area 2 days earlier, dropping about 8 inches of snow on the pass. But the plows had been working around the clock to keep the road open. The forecast called for partly cloudy skies with light winds. Not ideal, but within acceptable parameters for an experienced mountain driver. I left Salt Lake City around 6 a.m., giving myself plenty of time to reach Jackson before dark. Driving mountain passes at night is asking for trouble even in good weather, and I had no intention of pushing my luck. The load was relatively light, about 35,000 pounds of machinery parts, which would help with braking and stability on the downhill grades. The first part of the trip went smoothly. I made good time across the flat terrain of northern Utah and southern Idaho, and by early afternoon I was approaching the base of Teton Pass from the western side. The weather was holding, partly cloudy as predicted with temperatures in the mid-20s and light winds. Perfect conditions for a winter mountain crossing. I stopped at the chain-up area to put on my tire chains even though the road conditions didn't technically require them. Chains are a pain to install and they slow you down, but they can save your life if conditions deteriorate suddenly. In the mountains, it's better to be over-prepared than sorry. The ascent went without incident. My truck climbed steadily through the switchbacks, maintaining a consistent speed and staying well within the performance envelope of my engine and transmission. The road was mostly clear with just patches of snow and ice in the shadowed areas where the sun couldn't reach. Other drivers were maintaining safe following, distances and appropriate speeds, which is always a good sign on mountain roads. At the summit, I stopped at the scenic overlook to check my brakes and let my engine cool down before beginning the descent. The view was spectacular. The Teton Range stretching away to the north. The Snake River Valley spread out below and Jackson Hole visible in the distance like a toy town. On clear days like this, it's easy to understand why people fall in love with the Mountain West. But I wasn't there for sightseeing. I had a job to do, and that job required getting my load safely down the eastern side of the pass. The descent on Teton Pass is even more challenging than the climb. A long, steep grade with tight curves and limited visibility. It's the kind of road where you use your Jake brake religiously, downshift early and often, and pray that your service brakes don't overheat. I began the descent in low gear, maintaining about 25 miles per hour and using my exhaust brake to control speed without relying too heavily on my service brakes. The road was in good condition, recently plowed with sand and salt applied to the high traffic areas. Visibility was excellent, with clear views around most of the curves. Everything was going exactly as it should. I was 2/3 of the way down the pass, maybe 5 miles from the bottom, when I saw the jackknifed semi blocking the road ahead. It was a massive wreck, the kind that stops traffic for hours and sometimes kills people. The truck was a late model Peterbilt pulling a refrigerated trailer, and it had gone sideways across both lanes of the highway at the outside edge of a sharp right-hand curve. The tractor was pointing downhill. The trailer was angled across the uphill lane, and there was no way to get past the wreckage. Worse, the truck appeared to be sliding. Even as I watched, it was moving slowly sideways down the steep grade, dragging its locked wheels and leaving dark gouges in the asphalt. In a few more seconds, it would slide off the edge of the road and tumble hundreds of feet down the mountainside, probably taking the driver with it. I hit my brakes hard, harder than I normally would on a steep grade, but I had no choice. My own truck began to slow rapidly, the Jake brake howling and my service brakes grabbing with everything they had. Behind me, I could hear the screech of locked wheels as other vehicles reacted to the sudden stop. My truck came to a halt about 50 feet from the jackknifed semi, close enough to see the terror on the other driver's face through his windshield. He was conscious and apparently unhurt, but trapped in a truck that was slowly sliding toward disaster. I could see him working frantically with his controls, probably trying to get the truck moving again, but jackknifed trucks don't unkink themselves easily. I set my parking brake and grabbed my CB microphone. "Breaker 19 emergency, this is Mountain Mike at the bottom of Teton Pass. We've..." Got a jackknife semi-blocking both lanes. Truck is sliding toward the edge. We need emergency services up here right now. The response was immediate. Mountain Mike, this is Wyoming State Patrol Dispatch. Can you give us more specific location information? I looked around for mile markers or other identifying features. About mile marker 15 on Highway 22, eastern approach to Teton Pass. Sharp right-hand curve with a steep drop-off. Truck is sliding and we're going to lose the driver if we don't get help fast. Copy that, Mountain Mike. Units are en route. Can you provide assistance to the other driver? I looked at the jackknife truck again. It had slid another few feet while we'd been talking, and now the trailer's rear wheels were hanging over empty space. The driver was still conscious, still moving around in his cab, but he was running out of time and options. I'm going to try, I told the dispatcher. But I need traffic stopped behind me. This whole situation is about to get ugly. I climbed out of my truck and started walking toward the jackknifed semi, trying to figure out how to help without making the situation worse. The truck was balanced precariously on the edge of the road, held in place only by the friction between its locked wheels and the asphalt. Any additional weight or movement might send it over the edge. But as I got closer, something started to feel wrong about the whole scene. The jackknife truck looked real enough. I could see the details of its construction, read the company name on the door, even make out the DOT numbers on the side of the trailer. But there were no skid marks on the road leading up to the wreck, no debris from the accident, no signs of the violent forces that would have been involved in a truck losing control on a steep mountain grade. More disturbing was the fact that I couldn't hear the truck's engine running. A driver in that situation would have the engine at full throttle, trying to get enough power to the wheels to stop the sliding. But the Peterbilt was silent, as if its engine wasn't running at all. Hey, I called out to the driver, yo, can you hear me? The figure in the cab turned toward me and I got my first clear look at his face. What I saw made my blood run cold. The driver had no face. Where his features should have been was just smooth, pale skin like an unfinished mannequin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a blank expanse of flesh that somehow managed to convey desperate terror despite having no features to express emotion. I stumbled backward, my rational mind trying to process what I was seeing. Hallucination, I thought. Altitude sickness maybe, or carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty exhaust system. But the faceless driver was still there, still visible, still trapped in a truck that was sliding inexorably toward disaster. That's when I noticed the other vehicles that had stopped behind me. There were at least 6 cars and 2 other trucks backed up behind my rig, all with their emergency flashers on, all filled with people who were obviously concerned about the situation ahead. I could see drivers and passengers getting out of their vehicles, talking on cell phones and pointing toward the jackknifed semi. But when I looked more closely at those people, I realized they all had the same featureless faces as the trapped truck driver. Men, women, even what appeared to be children, all with smooth, blank skin where their faces should have been. I spun around looking back toward the jackknife truck and discovered it had vanished. Not slid over the edge, not been removed by some impossibly fast recovery crew, but simply disappeared. The road was clear, both lanes open, with no sign that there had ever been an accident at that location. No skid marks, no debris, no gouges in the asphalt where the truck had been sliding. The other vehicles were gone too. The line of cars and trucks that had been backed up behind me had vanished as completely as the jackknifed semi. I was alone on the mountain highway, standing in the middle of the road like a fool talking to nobody. My CB radio crackled with the voice of the state patrol dispatcher. Mountain Mike, we have units en route to your location. What's the current status of the jackknifed vehicle? I walked back to my truck on unsteady legs, trying to figure out how to explain what had just happened. Dispatch. Disregard that emergency call. The situation has been resolved. Copy that, Mountain Mike. The other truck was able to get back on the road. I looked at the empty highway ahead of me, perfectly clear in both directions. Yeah, something like that. Everything's fine up here now. Glad to hear it, driver. Have a safe trip. I climbed back into my cab and sat there for several minutes trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. The logical explanation was that I'd hallucinated the entire event. The jackknife truck, the faceless people, all of it. Mountain driving can be stressful, especially in winter conditions. And stress can cause the mind to play tricks. But the hallucination theory didn't explain why other drivers had apparently seen the same thing I had. According to my CB radio, there had been a backup of traffic behind me, other vehicles that had stopped in response to the emergency. The state patrol dispatcher had confirmed that she'd received multiple reports about the accident. Yet now the road was completely empty, as if none of those other vehicles had ever existed. I put my truck in gear and continued down the mountain, maintaining my normal speed and following all the safety protocols I'd developed over the years. The rest of the descent was uneventful, and I reached Jackson without any further incidents. But I couldn't shake the memory of what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, on that mountain highway. Over the next few weeks, I found myself researching accidents on Teton Pass, looking for some explanation for the phantom jackknife. What I discovered was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Teton Pass has been the site of dozens of fatal accidents over the years, many of them involving trucks that lost control on the steep grades and either crashed into the rock walls or went over the edge. Several of these accidents had occurred at or near mile marker 15, the exact location where I'd seen the jackknifed semi. Most disturbing was an accident that had happened in 2003 involving a refrigerated Peterbilt that had jackknifed on the eastern descent during a winter storm. The truck had slid sideways across both lanes before going over the edge, killing the driver instantly. The accident had tied up traffic for hours while recovery crews worked to clear the wreckage. The description of that accident matched exactly what I'd witnessed, down to the type of truck and the specific location on the highway. But that crash had happened 16 years before my encounter, and the driver had been killed instantly when his truck went over the edge. I talked to other drivers who regularly run Teton Pass, and several of them had their own stories about phantom accidents on that stretch of road. Overturned trucks that disappeared when you got closer. Cars wrapped around trees that weren't there when you looked directly at them. Emergency crews responding to accidents that had already been cleared. It's like the mountain remembers, one old-timer told me at a truck stop in Jackson. All those crashes, all those people who died on that road, sometimes it plays them back for drivers who are in the right state of mind to see them. What kind of state of mind? I asked. Stressed, tired, scared, guys who are pushing too hard or taking too many risks. Maybe it's the mountain's way of warning us to slow down and be careful. Whether that explanation is true or not, I've never again seen phantom accidents on Teton Pass. But I approach that stretch of highway with even more caution now. More awareness of the dangers that lurk on mountain roads and more respect for the drivers who've died trying to make a living in the mountains. I still run loads over the pass regularly. It's part of my territory, and I'm not going to let one unexplained incident change how I make my living. But I'm more careful now, more conscious of the fact that mountain highways are dangerous places where the margin for error is razor thin. And sometimes late at night when I'm descending those steep grades with a heavy load, I wonder if the phantom accidents I might see are warnings about crashes that have already happened, or previews of disasters that are yet to come. The mountains have their own memory, their own way of keeping track of the blood and metal that has been spilled on their slopes. Sometimes that memory bleeds through into the present, showing us echoes of tragedies that have already played out. Maybe that's not such a terrible thing. Maybe we need those reminders of how quickly things can go wrong, how important it is to respect the road and the forces that can destroy us in an instant. The jackknife that never happened taught me that there are worse things than mechanical failure or bad weather on mountain roads. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can encounter is the memory of all the drivers who didn't make it home. I've been running freight across this country for 23 years, and I thought I'd seen everything the road could throw at me. Bad weather, drunk drivers, mechanical breakdowns that left me stranded in the middle of nowhere. Hell, I even had a bear climb into my cab once when I was parked at a rest stop in Montana. But what happened to me on Highway 20 in Nebraska last October still makes my hands shake when I think about it. It was one of those endless autumn nights when the darkness seems to swallow everything beyond your headlights. I was hauling a load of farm equipment from Omaha to North Platte, running behind schedule because of a delay at the shipper. The highway stretched out ahead of me like a black ribbon, empty except for the occasional pair of taillights in the distance or the brief flash of oncoming traffic. The radio was playing some late-night talk show, the host's voice a comforting drone in the cab as I settled in for the long haul. That's when I first noticed them in my mirrors, a pair of headlights that seemed to appear out of nowhere about a quarter-mile behind me. At first I didn't think much of it. Could have been another trucker or maybe just a car that had been running dark and finally turned on their lights. But as the miles rolled by, those lights stayed exactly the same distance behind me, never gaining, never falling back. I tried speeding up a little, pushing my rig from 65 to 70. The lights maintained their distance. I slowed down to 60, thinking maybe they'd pass. They slowed down too. Mile after mile, those headlights hung there in my mirrors like two glowing eyes watching my every move. The talk radio host was discussing conspiracy theories now, his voice taking on an eerie quality in the darkness, but I couldn't bring myself to change the station. Something about those lights behind me had me transfixed. After about 30 miles of this cat-and-mouse game, I started getting annoyed. If this joker wanted to pass, why didn't he just do it? The road was clear, visibility was good, and there was plenty of room. I reached for my CB radio and keyed the mic. "Hey, four-wheeler behind the Peterbilt. You been riding my tail for 30 miles. You want around, just say the word." Nothing but static came back. I tried again, this time addressing any trucker who might be listening. "Anybody else seeing this Yahoo behind me on Highway 20? The radio remained silent except for the occasional crackle of distant conversations I couldn't quite make out. The weirdness factor started climbing when I realized I hadn't seen any other traffic for over an hour. Not a single car, not another truck, nothing. Just me and those persistent headlights in my mirrors. The empty highway stretched endlessly ahead, and the radio had gone to static, the talk show host's voice fading into electronic snow. I tried tuning to other stations, but all I could find was that same hissing static as if something was jamming the airwaves. By the time I'd been followed for nearly an hour, my nerves were shot. The headlights never wavered, never changed their distance, never did anything that a normal vehicle would do. They just hung there, constant as death, making me feel like prey being stalked by some patient predator. My hands were sweating despite the cool October night, and I kept glancing at my mirrors more than I was watching the road ahead. Finally, I'd had enough. I saw a truck stop sign announcing a rest area in 5 miles, and I decided to pull off and confront whatever lunatic was playing games with me. Maybe it was just some kid with too much time on his hands, or a drunk driver who didn't realize what he was doing. Either way, I was going to put a stop to it. The thought of getting out of my truck and facing whatever was behind those lights made my stomach churn, but I'd rather deal with trouble head-on than let it follow me all the way to North Platte. As I approached the off-ramp, I checked my mirrors again. The lights were still there, maintaining their perfect distance. I put on my turn signal and started to slow down, expecting the other vehicle to either follow me off the highway or finally pass. Instead, something impossible happened. The lights continued straight, but instead of passing to my left as any normal vehicle would, they passed directly through the back of my trailer. I felt my blood turn to ice water as I watched those headlights emerge from the front of my cab in the side mirrors. Continuing down Highway 20 as if my entire rig was nothing more than a hologram. There was no sound of impact, no jarring or vibration, nothing to indicate that a physical vehicle had just passed through 43 feet of solid steel and cargo. The lights simply materialized on the other side of my truck and kept going, never deviating from their straight path down the highway. I pulled into the rest area with my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the truck into park. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty highway through my windshield, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. The radio had come back to life, playing a country song like nothing had happened. The night seemed normal again, too normal. Like the world was trying to convince me I'd imagined the whole thing, but I knew what I'd seen. Those lights had passed right through my truck like we weren't even there. I've hauled everything from live cattle to nuclear waste, and I know the difference between reality and hallucination. Whatever followed me for that hour on Highway 20 wasn't bound by the same rules that govern the rest of us. I never reported it to anyone official. Who would believe a story like that? But I've talked to other drivers since then, quietly, carefully, and I've heard whispers of similar experiences on that same stretch of highway. Some say it's the ghost of a driver who died in a head-on collision back in the 70s, doomed to follow the same route forever. Others think it's something older, something that was there long before the highway was built, attracted to the endless stream of travelers passing through its territory. All I know is that I avoid Highway 20 after dark now. I'll take the long way around, add 100 miles to my route if I have to, because somewhere out there in the Nebraska darkness, those lights are still following someone staying exactly a quarter mile back, patient as eternity, waiting for the right moment to reveal that the laws of physics are just suggestions when you're dealing with things that should have stayed dead. The mountain tunnels of West Virginia have always given me the creeps, even in broad daylight. There's something about driving through a hole blasted through solid rock, tons of stone hanging over your head, that makes you acutely aware of how small and fragile you really are. But the old tunnel on the West Virginia Turnpike, the one they finally closed down last year, that was in a class by itself for pure bone-deep terror. I'd been running the eastern routes for about 15 years when I first encountered what locals call the tunnel screamer. It was a foggy November night, the kind where your headlights barely cut through the mist and every shadow looks like it's moving. I was hauling electronics from Pittsburgh to Richmond, running a couple hours behind schedule because of the weather. The newer tunnel was closed for maintenance work, so traffic was being diverted through the old bore, the one they built back in the 50s, barely wide enough for modern trucks and lit with ancient fixtures that cast more shadows than light. As I approached the tunnel entrance, my engine started acting up. Not unusual for an older truck in mountain terrain, but the timing couldn't have been worse. I was hoping to make it through and maybe pull over at the next rest area to check things out. But about halfway through the tunnel, the engine started missing badly. I had no choice but to slow down to a crawl, my flashers blinking weakly in the gloom as I nursed the truck through that claustrophobic tube of concrete and stone. That's when I heard it for the first time, a sound that made every hair on my body stand up. Started as a low wail, barely audible over the rumble of my engine, but it grew steadily louder and more intense. Within seconds, it became a full-throated scream of pure agony, the kind of sound a human being might make if they were being torn apart alive. The scream seemed to come from everywhere at once, the walls, the ceiling, the road beneath my wheels, as if the tunnel itself was in unimaginable pain. My hands locked on the steering wheel as the scream reached a crescendo that made my teeth ache. It went on and on, rising and falling in waves, sometimes fading to a whisper before building back up to that soul-crushing shriek. I've heard plenty of scary sounds in my years on the road. Animals in distress, metal tearing apart in accidents, the screech of brakes failing. But this was something else entirely. This was the sound of suffering beyond human comprehension, raw and primal and absolutely terrifying. I tried to speed up to get out of that cursed tunnel as fast as possible, but my engine was having none of it. Every time I pushed the accelerator, the truck would shudder and the engine would miss even worse. I was trapped in there with that screaming, crawling along at maybe 15 miles per hour while something invisible poured its anguish into the air around me. My CB radio was nothing but static, and the fluorescent lights above flickered erratically, casting dancing shadows that made the tunnel walls seem to pulse like a living thing. The scream went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, just as I was considering abandoning my truck and running for daylight, the sound cut off abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it was almost as terrifying as the screaming had been. My ears rang in the sudden quiet, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. The tunnel felt different now, expectant, like something was waiting. That's when I saw the face. As I emerged from the tunnel into the foggy night, something moved in my peripheral vision. I turned to look at my passenger window, and there it was, a pale face pressed against the glass from outside, its features twisted in an expression of indescribable anguish. The skin was gray-white, almost translucent, and the eyes were nothing but dark holes that seemed to look right through me. The mouth was open in a silent scream, and I could see that the tongue was black, as if the thing had been burned from the inside. I jerked the wheel to the right, nearly jackknifing my trailer as I tried to get away from whatever was clinging to my truck. But when I looked back at the window, there was nothing there, just fog swirling in the wind and the distant glow of the tunnel entrance behind me. My engine suddenly smoothed out, purring like it had just been serviced, and my radio crackled back to life with a country music station playing some upbeat song that seemed obscenely cheerful after what I'd just experienced. I pulled over at the next truck stop and spent 20 minutes walking around my rig, checking every inch of it for signs of damage or anything that might explain what I'd seen. The passenger side window was clean except for some condensation from the fog. There were no scratches, no handprints, no indication that anything had been pressed against the glass. But I knew what I'd seen, and more importantly, I knew what I'd heard in that tunnel. Over the years, I heard similar stories from other drivers. Most wouldn't talk about it openly. Truckers are a practical bunch, and stories about screaming ghosts don't fit well with our image of tough, no-nonsense professionals. But in quiet moments, when the conversation turned to the strange things we'd encountered on the road, the old tunnel would come up. Always in whispers, always with nervous glances, as if talking about it too loudly might summon the thing back. The stories were remarkably consistent. A scream that seemed to come from the tunnel itself, a pale face at the passenger window. The feeling of being watched by something that meant no harm but couldn't help the anguish it carried. Some drivers claim to have seen the full figure, a woman in a tattered dress walking through the tunnel with her arms outstretched, her mouth open in that eternal scream. I did some research when I got curious enough to overcome my fear. Turns out that tunnel was the site of a major accident back in 1967. A family of 5 was killed when their car broke down in the tunnel and was rear-ended by a drunk driver. The mother was thrown from the vehicle and died slowly, trapped beneath the wreckage while rescuers worked for hours to free her. Witnesses said her screams echoed through the tunnel for nearly 3 hours before she finally succumbed to her injuries. Whether that woman's spirit was what I encountered, I can't say for certain, but I know that tunnel was haunted by something that had suffered greatly and couldn't find peace. The screaming wasn't meant to frighten drivers. It was a cry for help that would never be answered, a plea for relief from pain that death hadn't been able to end. I made that run dozens of times over the years, and I heard the scream maybe half a dozen more times. Each encounter left me shaken and exhausted, but I never again saw the face at my window. Maybe she'd said what she needed to say to me that first night. Maybe she realized I couldn't help her any more than anyone else could. When they finally closed the old tunnel for good, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that no more drivers would have to face that bone-chilling scream in the darkness. But sadness too, because it meant that poor soul was alone again, with no one to witness her pain. No one to remember that she'd existed and suffered and died in that cold concrete tomb beneath the mountain. Sometimes on quiet nights when I'm driving through other tunnels, I find myself listening for that scream. Part of me hopes I'll never hear it again. But part of me knows that some suffering is too great to be contained by death. And somewhere in the darkness of the world, there are still voices crying out for someone to hear them and remember. Route 80 through Pennsylvania cuts through some of the most beautiful country in America, rolling hills and farmland that looks like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. During the day, it's peaceful and scenic, the kind of drive that reminds you why you love being on the road. But at night, especially in the stretch between the Delaware Water Gap and Stroudsburg, that same highway becomes something else entirely. A corridor where the past refuses to stay buried. I was making a run from Newark to Chicago, loaded down with auto parts and running about 4 hours behind schedule thanks to traffic delays in New York. It was well past midnight when I hit that particular stretch of Route 80, the kind of deep night when most sensible people are safe in their beds and the highway belongs to us truckers and the occasional insomniac. The radio was playing some oldies station, Glenn Miller and Tommy Dorsey, music that seemed to drift out of another era entirely. That's when I saw him for the first time, a figure walking along the shoulder of the highway, moving slowly but deliberately eastward against the flow of traffic. At first glance, he looked like any other pedestrian who'd had car trouble or was just down on his luck. But something about his posture and the way he moved caught my attention. As my headlights swept over him, I could see he was wearing what looked like an old military uniform, the kind you'd see in World War II movies. I slowed down, thinking I should stop and offer help. Nobody should be walking along a major highway at that time of night, especially not someone who looked like he might be elderly or confused. But as I pulled alongside him, something made me hesitate. The soldier, and I could see now that's exactly what he was, complete with garrison cap and service ribbons, turned to look at my truck. That's when I noticed he was limping badly, favoring his left leg like he'd taken shrapnel or a bullet. What really stopped me cold was his face. Even in the dim glow of my running lights, I could see he was young, maybe 20 or 25, with the kind of fresh-scrubbed look that belonged to boys who'd grown up on farms and in small towns before the war took them. But his eyes, Christ, his eyes were old, older than time, filled with a weariness that no 25-year-old should ever have to carry. He raised his right hand to his forehead in a crisp military salute, holding it steady as my truck passed. I instinctively saluted back, an old habit from my own army days, and kept watching him in my mirrors. 1 second he was there, clearly visible in my taillights, and the next he was gone. Not faded away or walked out of sight. Gone, like he'd never existed at all. I pulled over at the next rest area and sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The logical part of my mind said I was overtired, that I'd been hallucinating or maybe seen shadows and filled in the details with my imagination. But I knew better. I'd been driving long enough to know the difference between road fatigue and genuine strangeness, and what I'd encountered back there was as real as the steering wheel in my hands. Over the next few years, I made that same run dozens of times, and I started looking for the soldier every time I drove Route 80 after dark. I saw him maybe once every 4 or 5 trips, always in the same general area, always walking eastward with that distinctive limp, always offering that same respectful salute before vanishing into the night. Sometimes other drivers would mention seeing him too, usually in hushed conversations at truck stops when the topic turned to the weird things we'd encountered on the road. But it was on a cold February night about 3 years after my first sighting that I had my most memorable encounter with the walking soldier. I was running late again. Seems like I'm always running late on that particular route, and the weather was turning nasty, with snow starting to fall and the temperature dropping fast. The highway was nearly empty except for a few other trucks and the occasional car braving the increasingly treacherous conditions. I spotted the soldier about 2 miles ahead, his figure barely visible through the swirling snow. He was struggling more than usual, the limp more pronounced, and I could see he was having trouble making progress against the wind and cold. Without really thinking about it, I pulled over onto the shoulder ahead of him and climbed out of my cab. "Hey, soldier," I called out, my voice nearly lost in the wind. "You need a ride?" He looked up at me, snow gathering on the shoulders of his olive drab uniform, and for a moment I thought he was going to speak. His mouth opened slightly and I could see the same weariness in his eyes, but also something like gratitude. He nodded once, slowly, and started limping toward my truck. I opened the passenger door and helped him climb up into the cab. He moved carefully, favoring that left leg, and I could see dark stains on his trouser leg that looked suspiciously like old blood stains. Up close, his uniform was authentic down to the last detail. The fabric, the buttons, even the smell of wool and leather, and something else I couldn't quite identify. "Where you headed, son?" I asked as I climbed back behind the wheel. But he didn't answer, just sat quietly in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead through the windshield. He was solid enough. I could hear the seat creaking under his weight, could see the condensation from his breath on the window. But there was something insubstantial about him too, like he was only partly there. We rode in silence for the next hour, the soldier never moving except to occasionally shift position to favor his injured leg. The radio played those same old war-era songs, and I found myself wondering if he recognized any of them, if they brought back memories of dances and sweethearts and Saturday nights before the world went crazy. Every now and then I'd glance over at him, trying to read his expression, but his face remained blank, focused on something only he could see. As dawn started to break over the Pennsylvania hills, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, my passenger began to fade. It happened gradually, like a photograph slowly losing its definition, until he was just a vague outline in the seat beside me. He turned to look at me one last time, and I could see him mouth the words, "Thank you," before he disappeared entirely, leaving only the faint scent of old wool and the slightly warm impression of where he'd been sitting. I pulled over at the next truck stop and bought a cup of coffee, my hands shaking as I tried to process what had just happened. The waitress, a middle-aged woman who'd probably been working there for years, noticed my condition and asked if I was all right. On an impulse, I described my experience, half expecting her to think I was crazy. Instead, she nodded knowingly. "You met Jimmy Kowalski," she said matter-of-factly. "He shows up every winter when the weather gets bad. Been doing it for years now." She told me the story she'd heard from other drivers, pieced together over time from various encounters. Jimmy Kowalski had been a local boy, drafted in 1943 and shipped out to the Pacific Theater. He'd made it through Guadalcanal and Saipan, took shrapnel in his leg during the invasion of Okinawa, but refused evacuation because he wouldn't leave his unit. The war ended while he was still recovering in a field hospital, and he was supposed to ship home in December of 1945. He never made it. The transport plane carrying him and dozens of other wounded soldiers went down in a storm over the Atlantic. No survivors, no wreckage ever found. Jimmy Kowalski died just a few hundred miles from home after surviving some of the worst fighting in the Pacific, and his body was never recovered for burial. His family lived just a few miles from here, the waitress explained. His mother used to walk that same stretch of highway every night for years after the war ended, hoping he'd come home. When she died in 1962, people started seeing him instead, walking the same route she'd taken, trying to make it home to a family that was no longer there. I've seen Jimmy maybe a dozen times since then, always offering him a ride when the weather's bad, always riding with him in comfortable silence until the sun comes up and he fades away. He never speaks, never acknowledges our previous encounters, but I like to think he appreciates the company. There's something profoundly sad about his story, but something noble too. A soldier who's been walking toward home for over 70 years, never giving up, never accepting that some journeys can't be completed. The last time I saw him was just a few months ago on a clear summer night when the highway was dry and safe. He was walking with less of a limp, his uniform looking cleaner and more pressed than usual. When he saluted as I passed, there was something different in his expression. Not the bone-deep weariness I'd grown accustomed to, but something that looked almost like peace. I haven't seen him since, and I'm wondering if maybe after all these years Jimmy Kowalski has finally found his way home. Part of me hopes so, because no soldier should have to march forever. But part of me will miss him too, because in a world that's forgetting what sacrifice means, he was a reminder that some duties are too important to abandon, even in death. Every time I drive Route 80 at night now, I find myself looking for that familiar figure on the shoulder, hoping to see him one more time, but understanding if I don't. Because sometimes the greatest honor we can show the dead is to remember their stories and carry them forward, even when they've finally found the rest they've earned. Ice road trucking is not for the faint of heart. You're hauling tons of freight across frozen lakes and rivers, trusting that a few feet of ice will hold the combined weight of your truck, trailer, and cargo while you navigate some of the most remote and dangerous terrain in North America. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and you're breaking through into water so cold it'll kill you in minutes, assuming the impact doesn't do you in first. I've been running ice roads for 12 years, and I've seen good drivers disappear without a trace, swallowed by the unforgiving wilderness like they never existed. But what happened to me on the run from International Falls to Thunder Bay last winter was something that went beyond the normal dangers of ice road trucking. It was something that made me question everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the thin line between them in those frozen wastes where civilization ends and the old world begins. I was hauling mining equipment up to a remote site near Thunder Bay. Heavy machinery that couldn't wait for the spring thaw to get where it needed to be. The ice road season was already running late because of an unusually warm winter, and the companies were pushing hard to get their freight moved before the ice became too unreliable. I'd made this run dozens of times over the years, knew every twist and turn of the route, every place where the ice got sketchy and you had to slow down and pray. It was one of those brutally clear nights when the temperature drops so low that the air itself seems to crystallize when your breath freezes before it leaves your lungs, and the aurora borealis dances across the sky in sheets of green and blue fire. The kind of night that makes you feel very small and very alone in the vast emptiness of the North Country. My truck's heater was working overtime, but I could still feel the cold seeping through the steel and glass, trying to claim me like it had claimed so many others over the years. I was about 20 miles out from the halfway point when I first saw the other truck. At first, it was just a distant glow on the horizon, headlights cutting through the darkness like twin stars. Nothing unusual about that. There were always a few other drivers making the run, and it was comforting to know you weren't completely alone out there in that frozen hell. As I got closer, I could make out the shape of the truck itself, an older Kenworth pulling what looked like a flatbed loaded with lumber. What struck me as odd was how fast the other driver was moving. Ice road trucking is all about patience and careful speed management. You push too hard, and the ice starts flexing under you, sending out spider web cracks that can turn into a death trap in seconds. But this guy was flying, doing maybe 50 or 60 miles per hour on ice that I wouldn't trust at 30. Either he was completely crazy or he knew something about the ice conditions that I didn't. I keyed my CB radio and tried to raise him. "Northbound Kenworth, this is the Pete about a mile back. You copy?" Nothing but static came back. I tried again, using the emergency channel this time. "Any truck on the ice road near mile marker 47, please respond." Still nothing. The radio was working fine. I'd been talking to other drivers earlier in the evening. But for some reason, I couldn't get through to the Kenworth. As I followed him across the lake, staying well back to avoid getting caught in any ice fractures his speed might be creating, I started noticing other strange things about the truck ahead of me. The exhaust stacks weren't putting out any visible vapor, which should have been impossible in temperatures that were hovering around 40 below. The running lights seemed too bright, casting an eerie blue-white glow that reflected off the ice in ways that didn't look quite natural. And most disturbing of all, I couldn't see any tire tracks in the snow-covered ice behind him, as if his truck was skimming across the surface without actually touching it. I was so focused on the mystery truck that I almost missed the danger signs developing in the ice around me. A low rumbling sound started emanating from beneath my wheels, the kind of deep, ominous groaning that every ice road driver learns to fear. The ice was flexing under the weight of my truck, stress fractures starting to form and spread in the beam of my headlights. I immediately slowed down and started looking for a place to stop and let the ice settle. But the Kenworth ahead of me never even touched his brakes. That's when the impossible happened. Right in front of my eyes, the other truck hit a section of bad ice and broke through. 1 second it was there, headlights blazing and diesel engine roaring, and the next it was gone, disappeared through the frozen surface like it had fallen through a trap door. I heard the crash of breaking ice, the splash of water, and then nothing but the wind whistling across the lake. I slammed on my brakes, bringing my own truck to a sliding stop about 100 yards from where the Kenworth had gone through. My heart was hammering as I grabbed my emergency kit and jumped out of the cab, expecting to find a gaping hole in the ice and maybe some debris floating in the black water beneath. Instead, I found myself standing on solid ice that showed no sign of damage whatsoever. I walked carefully to the exact spot where I'd seen the truck break through, testing each step with my weight before committing to it. The ice was thick and solid, at least 3 feet of it, more than enough to support a fully loaded semi. There were no cracks, no water seeping up through breaks in the surface, no sign that anything had disturbed the ice in months. It was as if the accident I'd just witnessed had happened in another dimension. I spent 20 minutes searching the area with my flashlight, looking for any evidence that another truck had been there. No tire tracks, no oil stains, no debris of any kind. The snow on the ice was pristine except for my own footprints. According to every shred of physical evidence, I was the only person who had been on that lake in days, possibly weeks. But I knew what I'd seen. I'd watched that Kenworth break through the ice as clearly as I'd ever seen anything in my life. The sound of it going under was still echoing in my ears. The image of those headlights disappearing beneath the black water burned into my memory. There had been another truck out there, and now it was gone, taking its driver with it into the frozen depths. I keyed my radio and called for help, reporting the accident to the authorities and requesting immediate rescue assistance. But when the response teams arrived 2 hours later, they found the same thing I had: solid ice with no sign of any disturbance. The rescue coordinator, a grizzled veteran of dozens of ice road recoveries, looked at me like I'd been drinking or suffering from hypothermia-induced hallucinations. "Son, there's been no accident here," he said, his voice kind but firm. "Ice this thick doesn't heal itself overnight. If a truck went through, there'd be a hole the size of a house, and it'd stay open for days in this weather. You sure you didn't just see some ice shifting in your headlights?" I wanted to argue, to insist that I'd seen what I'd seen, but I could hear how crazy it would sound. Instead, I just nodded and thanked him for coming out, then climbed back into my truck and continued on to Thunder Bay. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd witnessed something beyond the normal laws of physics, something that existed in the gaps between what we know and what we fear. Over the next few days, I did some research at the truck stops and supply depots, asking old-timers if they'd ever heard of similar incidents. Most just shook their heads and changed the subject. Ice road drivers are superstitious by nature, but they don't like talking about the things that keep them awake at night. Finally, an ancient Ojibwe mechanic named Frank Beargrease pulled me aside and told me what he thought I'd encountered. "You saw the phantom rig," he said, his weathered face serious in the dim light of the garage. "Been running these ice roads for 40 years, ever since the first truck broke through and drowned back in 1987. Driver's name was Billy McKenzie, young guy from Duluth with a wife and 2 kids. He was pushing too hard, trying to make one more run before the ice got too thin. They never recovered his body or his truck. Lake's too deep out there, and the current took them under the ice shelf. Frank told me that Billy's phantom truck appears every winter, usually to drivers who are running alone on the most dangerous sections of the route. Some see it as a warning, slowing down when they witness the spectral crash and avoiding similar accidents. Others think it's Billy's spirit, still trying to complete that last run, doomed to break through the ice every night for eternity. "The ice remembers," Frank said, his dark eyes reflecting something ancient and unknowable. "Up here, where the cold never really leaves, the ice remembers everything that ever happened on it. Billy's accident, it's still happening, will always be happening. Time doesn't work the same way when the temperature hits 50 below and the aurora comes out to dance. I've made the ice road run dozens of times since that night, and I've seen Billy's phantom truck 3 more times. Each encounter follows the same pattern: the mysterious Kenworth running too fast for conditions, the impossible crash through solid ice, the complete absence of any physical evidence. Each time I stop and search for signs of the accident, and each time I find nothing but pristine ice and the growing certainty that I've witnessed something that exists outside the normal flow of time and space. The most recent sighting was just last month, on a night when the northern lights were particularly active, painting the sky in colors that don't have names. As I watched Billy's truck disappear through the ice once again, I found myself wondering if maybe that's what happens to all of us in the end. We become ghosts trapped in the moments of our greatest failures, doomed to repeat them forever in the places where we died. But maybe there's something else going on, something more hopeful. Maybe Billy's phantom runs aren't about punishment or eternal suffering. Maybe they're about dedication, about a driver so committed to his work that not even death can stop him from trying to complete his deliveries. In a profession where we pride ourselves on getting the job done no matter what, there's something almost noble about that kind of stubborn persistence. Either way, I always slow down when I see those phantom headlights ahead of me, and I always say a little prayer for Billy Mackenzie as I drive over the spot where his truck went through. Because out there on the ice roads where the margin between life and death is measured in inches of frozen water and degrees below zero, we're all just one mistake away from joining the phantoms who run the routes forever, carrying ghost loads through an endless winter night.